It was just another early morning in the sprawling estate of the Harper family, nestled in the quiet suburbs of Connecticut. The house loomed like a silent giant, majestic, almost intimidating in its size, and as cold as the stone it was built from. The windows gleamed with the reflection of the pale morning sun, casting a golden hue that made the marble floors shine underfoot. The smell of fresh coffee wafted through the house, mingling with the faint scent of polished wood and new linens. This was the home of the Harpers, affluent, respected, and utterly unbothered by the lives of those who lived to serve them. In the heart of this opulence moved Ellie, a maid who had worked in the estate for the past decade. She was familiar with the quiet rhythm of this house, having learned its every nook and cranny over the years. The hum of the central air, the soft swish of the heavy curtains, the soft clink of silverware. Everything had its place, and Ellie was its keeper. She glided through the kitchen, setting the table for breakfast as if she was part of the house itself, unnoticed and invisible. Yet, despite the grandeur surrounding her, Ellie was anything but invisible. There was a quiet power in the way she moved, an inherent strength that made her stand apart from the others. But today, it felt as if she was losing a battle she never asked to fight, the battle of being seen. She reached for the plates, her fingers brushing against the cold porcelain, when a voice broke the silence. "Does she always smell like that?" The words came from the dining room, where Mrs. Harper sat with a few of her friends, sipping mimosas and chatting. The voice wasn't loud, but it was cutting, sharp as a blade. Ellie's heart tightened for a second, but she kept her hands steady, her back straight. It was the same every time. The subtle sneers, the whispered comments, the underlying judgment. The kind of judgments that were always about things she couldn't change. Her accent, her clothes, the smell that lingered around her, lemongrass. "Yes," another voice chimed in, this one dripping with a patronizing tone. "It's so earthy, like something you'd find in a garden." Ellie could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't look up. She couldn't afford to. Not now. With a practiced ease, Ellie placed the silverware on the table, making sure everything was perfectly arranged. Her movements were automatic, efficient, but inside, she was breaking into pieces. Lemongrass, they had said. She had no choice but to wear the scent, because that was what her grandmother had always used. Her grandmother who had raised her in the small town of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It wasn't just the scent of lemongrass. It was the smell of home, of a childhood spent learning the art of natural skincare. The art of taking care of herself in a world that didn't care about her. But to the Harpers and their guests, the lemongrass was nothing but a mockery. To them, it was a symbol of her place in this world, the maid, the outsider, the invisible one. They had no idea that the oils she used on her skin were far more than a fragrance. Ellie's mind wandered to those nights she spent in the attic of the house, surrounded by old jars filled with homemade balms and creams. Her grandmother had taught her how to make them, how to blend the oils and ingredients from the plants around their small home. Lemongrass, lavender, chamomile, they weren't just scents. They were healing, they were protection. They were the very essence of everything Ellie had learned before she'd left home, before she'd come to Connecticut to escape the poverty of the South. Her grandmother had always told her, "One day, this will be your way out. Just keep believing in yourself, Ellie. Don't let the world tell you your worth." Ellie could still hear her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind, just as clearly as if she were standing next to her now. She sighed, and for the briefest moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the years she had spent here, surrounded by people who would never understand her. People who looked at her as if she was nothing more than a service, something to be used and discarded. Yet, in the pit of her stomach, something stirred. A quiet, yet undeniable strength. A strength that had been there all along, buried beneath the surface. They could mock her. They could whisper about the way she smelled. But they would never break her. Not really. Ellie finished setting the table and straightened her back. She walked out of the room with her head held high, her mind already working, calculating. She didn't belong here, not in the way they thought she did. She was here for a reason. A quiet reason, but one that would soon be revealed. In the hallway, As Ellie passed the grand staircase, she felt a flicker of doubt. Could she really make a life for herself beyond this place? Could she really escape the narrative they had written for her? But then, as if answering her own thoughts, Ellie's gaze shifted to a small photograph hanging on the wall. A picture of her grandmother, standing proudly in the garden, surrounded by blooming flowers. The woman who had raised her, who had given her the tools to survive in a world that often seemed stacked against her. If Grandma could do it, so can I, Ellie thought. She could. She had to. Her life, her real life, was just beginning. And one day, the people who looked at her with disdain would know her name. They would know her story, and they would remember her, not as the maid who smelled like lemongrass, but as the woman who built an empire from nothing, a woman who refused to stay invisible any longer. Ellie stood in the corner of the estate's massive kitchen, her back to the rest of the world, her focus completely absorbed by the task at hand. The Harpers were hosting another of their exclusive soirees, and she had been asked to help prepare the hors d'oeuvres for their distinguished guests. She was always given the thankless jobs, arranging flowers, tidying up, or making sure the champagne flutes sparkled. Tasks that kept her busy in the background, unseen by anyone who mattered. But as Ellie carefully arranged the finger foods on the silver trays, her mind drifted to a memory that had never quite left her. She was only 12 years old, living in the same small town in Louisiana where she had been born. It had been one of those scorching summer days when the air felt thick with heat, and the sounds of cicadas echoed through the neighborhood. Her grandmother had been sitting on the porch, weaving a basket, and Ellie had been sitting next to her, watching the sun slip lower in the sky. "Grandma, why do we always make our own soap and oils?" Ellie had asked one afternoon, curious about why they didn't buy store-bought products like the other people in town. Her grandmother had smiled gently, her weathered face softening as she looked at Ellie. "Because, my girl, there's power in making things with your own hands. The world out there will always try to tell you that you're not enough. But if you can make something of value, something that heals and nourishes, then no one can take that away from you." Ellie had never really understood the full depth of those words. But as she worked on the trays, the scent of lemongrass filling her senses, those words resurfaced in her mind, as clear as day. She realized how deeply ingrained those teachings were in her, even now as she stood in the heart of Connecticut, so far from the little house she had grown up in. Back in the present, she felt a sharp pang in her chest as the clinking of glasses interrupted her thoughts. She knew they were talking about her again. "She's been here for years, hasn't she? Seems like she'll always be just a maid," came the voice of Mrs. Harper's closest friend, a woman Ellie had never really liked. Her name was Patricia, and she always wore a cold, almost predatory smile, as though the world owed her something. Ellie could feel the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. The quiet mockery in their voices was something she had grown used to. Yet, each time it happened, it felt like a slow burn, a constant reminder that no matter how hard she worked, she would always remain on the outside looking in. "Oh, it's just a phase. You know how people like that never stay in one place too long. They just fade into the background eventually," Patricia continued, her words punctuated with a laugh that was anything but warm. Ellie's fingers gripped the tray a little harder, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't show them that their words had any effect on her. She had worked too hard to build the walls that kept her emotions in check, too long to let their cruelty pierce her. But their words stung, and no amount of inner strength could stop the feeling of rejection from seeping in. The truth was, Ellie had grown up feeling invisible. Her mother, who had struggled with 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, had always told her that she was capable of anything, that her worth wasn't tied to how others saw her. But that didn't make the whispers go away. She'd seen how people looked at her, the way they assumed her life was simple and small because of her station. They didn't know that she had once dreamed of something bigger, something much bigger. Ellie had always had visions of building her own skincare line, creating something from the very oils and fragrances that reminded her of home. She just never thought it would happen in a world that seemed so indifferent to her. Ellie's mother had always believed in her, even when the world didn't. Her mother's words still echoed in her mind. "You are worth more than you know, Ellie." But now, standing in the cold, pristine kitchen, Ellie couldn't help but wonder, was that true? Was she really worth more than this? She finished setting down the final tray of hors d'oeuvres, her hands steady despite the growing tension in her chest. As she did so, she caught a glimpse of Mrs. Harper's reflection in the polished kitchen counter. Mrs. Harper was speaking animatedly to her guests, gesturing with her glass of champagne in a way that was both grand and practiced. Ellie's heart sank. This was the life she had been working towards, serving people who would never see her beyond her role. "Just keep your head down," she told herself. "One day things will change." But for now, she was trapped in this cycle of servitude. And it wasn't just the Harpers. It was the people who came into the house. Their guests, their friends, their family. All of them would look at her as if she were invisible, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. But deep down, Ellie knew that there was more to her than what met the eye. She had been underestimated her whole life. The moment she had stepped into this job as a young woman from Louisiana, she had been categorized. She had been placed in a box labeled Maid, small, insignificant, someone to be dismissed without a second thought. But that wasn't all she was. She could feel it in her bones. There was something more within her, something waiting to burst forth. As she moved from the kitchen to the back hall, Ellie stopped for a moment in front of the mirror. The woman staring back at her was familiar, yet different. Her eyes were tired, sure, but there was a spark of something else. Something that hadn't been there before. She could feel the weight of her grandmother's lessons pressing on her. And for the first time, Ellie didn't just see a maid in the mirror. She saw a woman who had something no one else could take away. A secret, something waiting to be unlocked. The harsh world outside might have tried to define her, tried to fit her into a mold, but Ellie wasn't going to let that happen. She had dreams. She had plans. And one day they would all see. Ellie's emotions swirled with a mix of anger and determination as she took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She wasn't going to be another invisible person in a world that loved to overlook her. It was time to fight back, quietly in the way only she knew how. She could already feel the shift beginning. Small, almost imperceptible, but powerful nonetheless. It was in the way she held herself now, in the way she moved through the house with a quiet confidence. Ellie wasn't just the maid anymore, not in her mind. And soon the world would realize it too. As she walked down the hallway, Ellie caught her reflection again in the polished surface of the hallway mirror. But this time, the woman staring back at her had something else in her eyes, an unmistakable sense of purpose. Ellie had always known how to survive in a world that didn't care about her. But now she was ready to thrive, and nothing would stop her. It had been a year since Ellie had first started feeling that quiet, undeniable shift within her. A year since the charity gala at the Harper estate had given her the courage to dream again, to believe that something more awaited her outside of this mansion, beyond the polished floors and cold, judgmental smiles. But the world she had built for herself in Connecticut was far from kind, and each day felt like a battle, both internal and external. She had worked harder than anyone else to stay invisible, but now she was beginning to understand the power of being seen. Ellie spent her days in the same unremarkable way, serving the Harpers, cleaning, cooking, tending to their guests. But at night, when the house fell quiet, Ellie's real work began. In the small, dimly lit corner of the attic where she had made her temporary quarters, she would pull out the old jars her grandmother had gifted her and begin experimenting with the oils she had once made in her childhood. Lemongrass, lavender, chamomile, all natural, all healing. There was something almost sacred in the way the oils came together, something that felt both powerful and ancient. She hadn't told anyone, not even Miss Lucille, the woman who had helped her get started. Ellie knew that people wouldn't understand her passion, wouldn't see the deep, underlying beauty in what she was creating. To them, it was just something as inconsequential as a fragrance, something to wear and forget. But to Ellie, it was more than that. It was the product of love and pain, the culmination of years of work and a deep connection to her roots. She worked tirelessly, creating small batches of handmade balms and lotions, experimenting with different combinations of oils until she found the right formula. Each jar was a labor of love, a tribute to her grandmother's teachings, and every time Ellie poured a new batch into a glass container, she felt a quiet sense of pride. Still, something held her back. A deep-seated fear that she wasn't enough, fear that her efforts would never amount to anything, fear that the world would never see her beyond the smell of lemongrass and the uniform she wore every day. That was, until one fateful morning, when she overheard a conversation that would ignite the spark of ambition in her soul. Ellie was polishing the silverware in the kitchen when she heard the voices from the dining room. Mrs. Harper, as always, was hosting a gathering of her friends, wealthy socialites who often dropped in for afternoon tea or lunch. Their laughter filled the room, punctuated by the occasional clink of fine china. But there was one conversation that Ellie couldn't ignore. "You know, I've been hearing about this new skincare line that's sweeping the internet," said one woman, her voice high and airy. "Apparently, it's all natural and has this incredible lemongrass scent. I've been thinking about ordering it, but I'm not sure if it's worth the hype." Another woman, who Ellie recognized as Patricia, the one who had once mocked her for her scent, leaned in, her eyes sparkling. "I've heard of it. It's actually a small business, some nobody from the Midwest, I think. But it's growing so fast. They say it's taking off in places like New York and California. It's all over the beauty blogs." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she held the silver tray. The words small business and lemongrass felt like a thunderclap in her ears. They were talking about something she knew, something she could create. The very oils her grandmother had taught her to make, the oils that had always been her secret to glowing skin, were now part of a bigger trend. The voices continued, but Ellie was no longer listening. Her thoughts were racing, her mind spinning with possibilities. If a small business in the Midwest could gain such traction, why couldn't she do the same? Why couldn't she build her own skincare empire? She had the knowledge, the skill, and the drive, everything she needed to create something meaningful. But it wasn't just the idea of a business that excited her. It was the thought of finally being seen. Not as a maid, not as someone to be dismissed, but as an entrepreneur, someone who had built something from the ground up. That evening, Ellie sat at her small desk in the attic, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. Her laptop was open in front of her, her fingers hovering over the keys. She had spent the last few hours researching the growing trend of small, homegrown skincare businesses. It was the perfect time for something like this, she thought. The beauty industry was embracing all-natural products more than ever, and the demand for sustainable, small-batch skincare was rising. Her heart pounded as she created a rough outline of her business plan. She would start small, perhaps with a website and a few handmade products. But she knew that once she gained traction, there was no limit to where it could go. She would build an empire, just as her grandmother had believed she could. As she worked late into the night, the weight of her decision settled in. It was a risk, a big one. She was already working full-time for the Harpers, and her time was limited. But Ellie had always been good at making time for the things that mattered. And this mattered more than anything else. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to the expectations of others. It wasn't about being the perfect maid or the invisible servant in the background. It was about creating something she could be proud of, something real, something that would prove once and for all that she was capable of more than they could ever imagine. The next morning, Ellie woke early, before the rest of the household stirred. She made herself a cup of tea and sat in the quiet of the house, letting the warmth of the mug settle into her hands. She thought about the future. It would take time. It would take effort. But Ellie was used to hard work. She was used to the struggle. What she wasn't used to was believing in herself. But now, with the glimmer of possibility before her, she realized that was exactly what she had to do. Over the next few weeks, Ellie's life became a careful balance between the tasks of her day job and the work she was doing to build her business. She pored over books about branding, marketing, and e-commerce. She researched the best suppliers for natural ingredients, finding companies that offered ethically sourced materials and sustainable practices. She began creating batches of her skincare products, testing new recipes and refining her formulas. She kept everything hidden from the Harpers, from the other staff. No one knew about her late nights spent researching or her plans to build something that could one day rival the very products they mocked. But Ellie knew that, deep down, the world would soon know her name. Iwa. To the rhythm of creation. Each jar of balm, each bottle of lotion, was a step closer to her dream. She poured her love into every product, her grandmother's teachings echoing in her mind with every drop of oil she added. And slowly, quietly, Ellie began to build something that was hers. Something real. Ellie was no stranger to hard work. She had spent her whole life in quiet rebellion, not against the world or the people around her, but against the version of herself that society had constructed. She had learned early that if you didn't fit into the mold others expected of you, the world would label you as unworthy. It had been a struggle, constantly fighting for the right to simply exist in her own skin. But now, with every batch of lotion she mixed and every jar of balm she sealed, Ellie was rebelling in a new way. This rebellion wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't about protesting or making noise. It was about quietly changing the narrative of her own life. As the weeks passed, Ellie's skincare business began to take shape. She had created her website, sourced ingredients from local suppliers who offered sustainable and cruelty-free products, and even started selling to a few close friends and family members. Each order that came through felt like a small victory, but Ellie knew she was just getting started. Her heart raced when she received an email one evening from a beauty influencer in New York. The subject line read, "Lemongrass Glow? We'd love to feature your products." Ellie couldn't believe it. The influencer had found her brand on social media and was interested in reviewing her products on their platform. It was a huge step forward, but Ellie didn't allow herself to get too excited. Not yet. She knew this was just the beginning, and the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles. But for the first time in her life, Ellie felt something she hadn't before: hope. She began to see the future not as an endless series of challenges, but as an open road. The next few days were a blur of excitement and preparation. Ellie had to ensure that her packaging was perfect and that every order was fulfilled with the utmost care. She couldn't afford mistakes. This was her chance to get noticed, and she wasn't about to waste it. She spent late nights in the attic, carefully labeling each jar of her skincare products and boxing them for shipping. She double-checked every detail, making sure that everything was flawless. She hadn't told anyone at the Harper estate about the email or the influencer. The idea of sharing her small triumph with people who had never believed in her felt strange. She wasn't ready to let them see her success yet. Instead, she continued with her work as usual, serving breakfast, cleaning the grand rooms, and doing the menial tasks no one else wanted to do. The reality of the estate was inescapable, and she had learned long ago that no one would ever see her as anything other than the maid. But Ellie wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived at the estate. She had come to understand that success wasn't about the approval of others. It was about finding the strength to move forward, even when the world tried to push you down. That strength was beginning to take root in her. One evening, after an exhausting day of preparing dinner and cleaning, Ellie retreated to her room in the attic, her mind buzzing with a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. She was on the verge of something bigger, something that could finally pull her out of the shadows. She had to believe that. She logged into her email account, checking for any new updates. There was an email from the influencer. This time it was a confirmation. The post was going live the next day, featuring her lemongrass-infused skincare line. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she read the email. This was it. With trembling hands, she quickly wrote a response, thanking the influencer for their support and telling them how much it meant to her. She hit send and then sat back in her chair, feeling a wave of satisfaction wash over her. She had done it. She had put herself out there, and someone had recognized her work. But as the excitement settled, Ellie's thoughts turned inward. She knew this was only the beginning. She had to grow her brand, create new products, and expand her reach. She wasn't going to stop until she had built something that could sustain her, something that would prove to the world that she was more than just a maid, more than just a background figure. She pulled her grandmother's old journal from the shelf, flipping through its pages until she found the familiar, faded handwriting. "Don't let the world define you, Ellie. You are more than they'll ever see. Make your mark and never look back." Ellie smiled softly, closing the journal with a quiet promise to herself. She wasn't going to let fear or self-doubt stop her. She was going to rise quietly and steadily, and when the time was right, she would be ready to take her place. The next morning, Ellie awoke to a flurry of notifications on her phone. She had been tagged in countless posts, and people were already leaving glowing reviews about her products. The influencer had given her brand a glowing endorsement, and her social media following had exploded. Her small business had gone from being a hidden passion project to a burgeoning brand in the span of a few hours. Ellie felt the excitement swell inside her chest as she watched her follower count grow. She couldn't believe it. This was happening. She had always dreamed of success, but it had always felt like something that belonged to other people. People who were born with wealth, connections, and opportunities. But here she was, building something from nothing, and it was finally paying off. Yet, even in the midst of her success, Ellie didn't allow herself to be swept away by the excitement. She had worked too long and too hard to let herself be distracted. She knew that success didn't come easily, and she wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through her fingers. She had learned to keep her head down, work quietly, and never show weakness. She wasn't about to let her guard down now. As Ellie continued to build her business, she began to notice small changes in herself. She carried herself with more confidence. She no longer hesitated to speak up in meetings or voice her opinions. She no longer accepted being dismissed or overlooked. She had learned the quiet power of owning her worth. It wasn't just about the money or the recognition. It was about the shift in her identity. Ellie was no longer the invisible maid. She was an entrepreneur, a businesswoman, and she had earned that title. It didn't matter that she was still working in the Harper estate. What mattered was what she was building for herself. Something that was hers, something she controlled. But as Ellie's confidence grew, so did the pressure. She had to keep up with demand, manage her growing business, and balance her responsibilities at the estate. Every day was a juggling act, and sometimes it felt like the weight of the world was bearing down on her. There were moments when she wondered if she was crazy for pursuing this dream, for daring to believe that she could succeed. But then she would remember her grandmother's words. "The world will try to break you, Ellie, but you are stronger than you know. Keep going." And Ellie did. She kept going. One evening, as she sat in her small attic room, Ellie received an unexpected phone call. It was from a major department store in New York. They had seen her products on social media and wanted to carry her line in their stores. Ellie's heart raced as the representative spoke, outlining the details of the deal. It was the break she had been waiting for, the opportunity to take her brand to the next level. But Ellie didn't rush to make a decision. She needed to think it through carefully. This was a big step, one that could change everything. She spent the next few days weighing the pros and cons, seeking advice from Miss Lucille, and thinking about the future of her business. It was a huge risk, but she knew it was a risk worth taking. The time had come for Ellie to step out of the shadows and into the light. Ellie finally made her decision. She would take the deal. She would push forward with her brand, and she would let the world see her for who she truly was. The quiet rebellion had worked. She had created something real, something that had the potential to change her life. And this was only the beginning. Ellie had always been a woman of patience, but there was something about the moment she'd signed the deal with the New York department store that made her feel like time itself had shifted. She was no longer a maid in the shadows. She was an entrepreneur with a legitimate business, an empire waiting to rise. Her hands were no longer just instruments of labor for others. They were now capable of creating and building something that would change the course of her life. The deal with the department store was monumental. It wasn't just a transaction. It was proof that her quiet rebellion, her years of sweat, late nights, and self-doubt had amounted to something real. In the past, she had walked through life constantly overlooked, constantly underestimated. But now, Ellie had proof that she was not invisible. She was a force to be reckoned with. Yet, even as the excitement of the deal set in, Ellie's mind was already racing. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. She had worked too hard, invested too much energy, to let this opportunity slip away. She wasn't just about to be noticed. She was about to carve out her place in the world. Her business, Lemongrass Glow, was no longer a hobby. It was a full-fledged enterprise, and Ellie was determined to see it thrive. But the pressure was immense. She had to make sure her products met the department store's high standards. She had to source more ingredients, scale her production, and create enough inventory to meet the demand. She had to navigate the complexities of retail, from packaging and labeling to contracts and distribution. And on top of it all, she had to maintain her full-time job at the Harper estate. In the quiet moments after her shift, Ellie would retreat to her small room in the attic. The flickering light of her desk lamp illuminated her tired face as she sat in front of her laptop, typing out emails, sending invoices, and coordinating with suppliers. She was used to the late hours by now, but this time it felt different. She wasn't just working to survive anymore. She was working to build something that would carry her far beyond the confines of this estate. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind every time she hit a roadblock, every time the doubt crept in. "You are more than they'll ever see, Ellie." Those words were the fuel that kept her going, even when the tasks seemed insurmountable. A few weeks into the deal, Ellie received her first shipment of custom packaging. She had worked tirelessly on the design. Sleek, minimalistic, and professional. The logo, a subtle green lemongrass sprig against a white background, looked stunning on the packaging. It was simple, yet it spoke volumes. It was the visual embodiment of everything Ellie wanted her brand to represent. Natural, healing, and unpretentious. The moment she opened the first box, the weight of what she was doing hit her. She wasn't just creating skincare products. She was creating a brand, a piece of herself to share with the world. She carefully opened the jars and filled each one with her signature lemongrass-infused balm. The scent wafted up to meet her, and for a moment, she closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. Felt like home, but the moment of peace was short-lived. There was still so much to do, and Ellie was starting to feel the strain. She was still working for the Harpers, still stuck in the same routine of serving and cleaning. But now, when she walked through the grand hallways of the estate, it felt like she was walking through someone else's life, someone else's world. The weight of her double life was beginning to take its toll. Ellie knew she couldn't keep up this pace forever. She had to make a decision. The pressure was too much and her time was stretched too thin. But Ellie had always been a fighter, and she refused to let go of either her dream or her job. The first step toward change came when she received a phone call from Miss Lucille. Ellie had been keeping her in the loop about her progress, and Miss Lucille had been offering advice and support. "You know, Ellie," Miss Lucille said, her voice warm and encouraging, "there's something special about what you're doing, but you can't do it all on your own. You need help. You need to start thinking about scaling your business." The words hit Ellie hard. She had known for a while that she couldn't keep juggling everything, but the idea of asking for help, of letting someone else in, felt foreign to her. She had always been the one to take care of everything, the one to shoulder the burden alone. But maybe, just maybe, Miss Lucille was right. "I think it's time," Miss Lucille continued, "to think about hiring some help. You need someone who can take some of this off your shoulders. That'll free you up to focus on growing your business, not just running it." Ellie sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the idea. It was terrifying. Letting someone else in meant trusting them with her dream. But at the same time, it felt like a necessary step forward. She had to let go of the notion that she could do everything herself. It was time to build a team, people who would help her expand her business and bring her vision to life. A week later, Ellie took the plunge and hired her first employee. Her name was Tessa, a bright young woman from a nearby town who had a background in marketing. Ellie had met her at a local farmer's market where she had been selling her skincare products. Tessa had expressed interest in Ellie's brand, and after a few conversations, They had both agreed that Tessa could help take Lemongrass Glow to the next level. The decision wasn't easy for Ellie. She had always prided herself on doing things on her own, but she knew it was time. Tessa brought fresh ideas and energy to the business, and together, they began working on marketing strategies, social media campaigns, and ways to expand the brand's reach. Tessa had experience in retail partnerships and helped Ellie establish relationships with local stores that were eager to carry her products. As Ellie sat in her small office, her eyes scanning over the list of tasks ahead, she realized something profound. This was real. Her dream was no longer a distant fantasy. It was happening. She wasn't just the maid who smelled like lemongrass. She was Ellie Martin, businesswoman, entrepreneur, and creator of Lemongrass Glow. Her heart swelled with pride, but she knew there was still work to be done. The road ahead was long, but she was no longer walking it alone. The first month with Tessa on board was a whirlwind of activity. They worked late into the nights, setting goals, planning product launches, and brainstorming ways to grow Ellie's presence in the market. Ellie felt like she was finally in control of her life, finally able to step away from the invisible role she had played for so long. With Tessa's help, Ellie's brand began to flourish. The first batch of products hit the department store shelves, and Ellie could hardly believe it when she walked into the store and saw her product displayed in the beauty aisle. It was a moment of triumph, but also of reflection. She thought back to the quiet nights when she had poured her heart into creating these products, when it had all seemed like a distant dream. And now, here it was, in the hands of strangers, ready to make a mark in the world. But even as her business grew, Ellie knew that she couldn't forget the lessons she had learned along the way. She couldn't forget where she had come from, how far she had come from the days of feeling invisible, of being judged for something as simple as the scent of lemongrass. The changes were not just external, they were internal as well. Ellie had transformed into a woman who knew her worth, who was willing to trust others and take the risks necessary to achieve her dreams. She was no longer hiding in the shadows, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. Ellie's business was thriving, but the road ahead was still filled with challenges. She had taken the first step of change, but she knew that to succeed, she would need to keep pushing forward. It was time to let go of the past, to stop seeing herself as the maid, and to embrace her new identity as a businesswoman. Lemongrass Glow was more than a product. It was a symbol of Ellie's resilience, her quiet strength, and her determination to build a life on her own terms. And she wasn't stopping now. Ellie had always known that growth meant sacrifice, and as her skincare business, Lemongrass Glow, continued to expand, the weight of her ambition began to press down on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. There was the pressure of scaling production, of making sure her products were meeting the growing demand. There was the pressure of maintaining the delicate balance between her day job at the Harper estate and the life she was creating for herself. And then there was the personal pressure, the constant reminder that everything she was building was on her shoulders alone. But even as the workload grew, Ellie felt something shift deep inside her. It wasn't just the business that was evolving, it was her own sense of self. She had spent years living in the shadows, putting herself last, letting the world dictate who she was and where she belonged. Now she was stepping into her own light. Lemongrass Glow wasn't just a skincare brand. It was a declaration of independence, a testament to everything she had endured and everything she had achieved. The first major breakthrough came when Ellie secured a partnership with a prestigious beauty retailer in New York. It wasn't just a local deal anymore. This was national. The email arrived one Tuesday morning, a subject line that Ellie would later remember as the moment her world changed. Excited to carry your brand in all locations across the US. When she read those words, Ellie's heart pounded. She felt a mixture of disbelief and triumph. She had made it. She had gone from a small-town girl making oils in her grandmother's kitchen to a business owner whose products were about to be sold in some of the country's most prestigious stores. Ellie sat back in her chair, staring at the email as the reality of it all settled in. This was no longer a dream, it was her new reality, and while that brought a sense of excitement, it also brought with it an avalanche of responsibility. There were new contracts to sign, shipments to manage, and, most importantly, employees to hire. It was time to build a real team, one that could take Lemongrass Glow to the next level. Ellie's first hire had been Tessa, who had quickly proven to be an invaluable part of the business. But as the orders grew and the brand expanded, Ellie realized she needed more support. She needed someone who could help manage the production side of things. Someone who had experience in scaling a business from the ground up. That's when she reached out to Sarah, a woman she had met at a business seminar a few months ago. Sarah was a logistics expert, and after a few discussions, Ellie knew she had found the right person to join her growing team. With Sarah on board, the infrastructure of Lemongrass, who could meet the demands of their expanding operation. Ellie was learning new things every day, things she had never imagined herself capable of. From creating efficient systems to negotiating with manufacturers, Ellie was stepping into her role as CEO of her own empire. But even as her team grew, Ellie couldn't completely let go of the old, ingrained habits of working alone. She often found herself staying late in her office, packing orders herself, or handling customer service requests. It was hard to trust others with her dream. But with Sarah and Tessa by her side, Ellie began to ease into the role of leader, trusting others, delegating tasks, and watching as her brand became a well-oiled machine. As the months passed, Ellie's company began to gain traction in the beauty industry. The influencer who had first written about her products continued to rave about Lemongrass Glow, and soon other beauty bloggers and Instagram influencers began to take notice. The brand was featured in a well-known beauty magazine, and Ellie's social media following exploded. It was an exhilarating time, but with it came new challenges. One of the most difficult decisions Ellie had to make was whether to continue operating from her small, rented warehouse or move to a larger space. She had outgrown the cramped building, but the thought of investing in a new space was intimidating. She had already taken on so much debt to fund the initial growth of her business. The idea of taking on more risk was terrifying, but Ellie knew it was the only way forward. After consulting with Sarah and Tessa, Ellie made the decision to move forward with leasing a larger space in Brooklyn. The new office was modern, spacious, and located in the heart of a trendy neighborhood known for its thriving small business community. It was a big leap, but it felt like the next logical step in her journey. The move was stressful. There were countless details to sort out, from setting up the new office to overseeing the production lines, but it also marked a major turning point. Ellie had taken another step toward building a legitimate, long-lasting business. She was no longer just a woman working out of her attic. She was running a company with a team, a brand, and a vision that could take over the beauty industry. One evening, after a particularly long day of unpacking and setting up the new office, Ellie found herself standing on the balcony, staring out at the skyline of Brooklyn. The city was alive with lights, and the sounds of the streets below filled the air. For the first time in a long while, Ellie felt like she could breathe. She thought back to those early days in the Harper estate, when she was just a maid, invisible, unnoticed. She thought of the mocking comments, the way people had looked down on her. And now, standing on this balcony, with a thriving business and a team behind her, Ellie realized something profound. She had never truly been invisible. The world had only made her feel that way, and now, she had created something that would ensure no one would ever overlook her again. The next few months were a blur of meetings, shipments, and product launches. Ellie's brand continued to grow, and the contracts kept rolling in. Her products were now available in department stores across the country, and Lemongrass Glow was being sold online in major beauty retailers' shops. Ellie was living the dream she had once only imagined, and yet, despite all the success, she felt a quiet longing, a desire to do more. Ellie had learned that building a business wasn't just about profits and recognition. It was about creating something that meant something to people. It was about making a difference. She had seen the impact her products had on people's lives, the way her skincare line made them feel good in their own skin. She had started out wanting to make a mark on the world, but now, Ellie realized that she could do more. She could give back. With that thought in mind, Ellie began to develop a plan to donate a portion of the profits from Lemongrass Glow to support women's shelters and organizations that helped women break free from abusive situations. She wanted to use her success to lift others up, to help the women who had been in situations similar to her own, feeling invisible, dismissed, and undervalued. As Ellie sat at her desk late one night, reviewing the numbers and brainstorming ideas for her next product line, she felt a sense of contentment wash over her. This wasn't just about building a business anymore. This was about creating a legacy of strength, resilience, and empowerment. She had started out as a maid, underestimated by the world, dismissed because of her status, her background, and her appearance. But now she was a woman who had created something real, something that would last long after she was gone. As Ellie looked out over the New York skyline once again, she realized that she was no longer just a woman with a dream. She was a woman with a purpose, and Lemongrass Glow was just the beginning. Ellie sat in the quiet of her office, surrounded by the hum of the city outside. The Brooklyn skyline spread out before her, a vast sea of lights stretching far beyond what her eyes could see. It had been a long day of meetings and conference calls, a never-ending cycle of product launches, inventory checks, and retail partnerships. Yet despite the overwhelming pace, Ellie felt a deep sense of contentment, a calm that had eluded her in the early days of Lemongrass Glow. She had come so far. From the dusty corners of the Harper estate to the bustling streets of Brooklyn, Ellie had carved out a space for herself in the world. No longer was she the maid who smelled like lemongrass, dismissed and invisible. Now, she was the founder and CEO of a thriving skincare empire, her products gracing the shelves of major retailers, her name synonymous with natural, healing skincare. She had built something from nothing, something that had caught the attention of people far beyond her wildest dreams. And yet, even in the midst of her success, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had built her empire, yes, but it was still rooted in the past that had tried to define her, to keep her small. She had spent so many years trying to prove herself to others, trying to escape the limitations that the world had placed on her. Now, she was ready to confront the very people who had once ignored her, the people who had looked at her as nothing more than a servant. It was the morning of the annual charity gala that the Harpers hosted every year, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Ellie wasn't working behind the scenes. This time, she was going as a guest. She had received an invitation from Mrs. Harper herself, who had heard about the success of Lemongrass Glow and wanted to personally congratulate Ellie. Ellie had hesitated when the invitation arrived. She had spent so many years working in the shadows of this house, always out of sight, always in the background. The idea of returning to that world felt strange, like stepping back into a life she had long since outgrown. But something inside her told her that this was the moment. This was her chance to show the world who she had become. And so, with a mixture of nerves and excitement, Ellie prepared for the evening. She stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, adjusting her dress. A sleek black gown that hugged her figure just right. It was simple yet elegant, a far cry from the gray uniform she had worn in the Harper Estate's kitchens. She had chosen it carefully, wanting to show up as a woman who had earned her place, not just as a former maid, but as a businesswoman who had built something meaningful. Ellie's reflection in the mirror was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the timid, quiet girl who had once walked the halls of the Harper estate with her head down. In her place stood a confident woman, poised and strong, someone who had overcome every obstacle placed in her way. She smiled at her reflection, a quiet but powerful affirmation of how far she had come. The gala was being held at the Harper's estate once again, the same grand mansion that had been the backdrop to so many years of Ellie's life. As she stepped out of her apartment and made her way to the event, she couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. This wasn't just a charity event. It was a symbol of her transformation, of the woman she had become. When Ellie arrived at the estate, she was greeted by the familiar sights: the grand staircase, the glittering chandeliers, the polished floors that seemed to reflect the lives of the people who lived here. The staff was busy, preparing for the evening's festivities, but Ellie's presence felt different now. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a guest, someone who had earned her place at the table. Mrs. Harper spotted her from across the room, her eyes widening with surprise as she walked toward Ellie. "Ellie, my, look at you," Mrs. Harper said, her voice laced with genuine admiration. "I hardly recognized you." Ellie smiled politely, her heart racing in her chest. This was it, the moment she had dreamed about. The moment she would stand before the people who had once looked down on her and show them just how far she had come. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," Ellie replied, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of everything she had been through. "It's good to see you." As Mrs. Harper led Ellie into the grand ballroom, Ellie couldn't help but notice the looks she was receiving. Whispers followed her wherever she went, and the guests who had once ignored her now regarded her with curiosity, and perhaps just a hint of jealousy. The same people who had once mocked her, who had once whispered about her scent and her place in this world, were now watching her as if they had never truly seen her before. Ellie made her way to the bar, her nerves beginning to settle as she took in the scene. She wasn't just a maid who had been invited to serve at this event. She was someone to be noticed, to be respected. She could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in how she was perceived. As Ellie took a sip of her champagne, she saw them, the Harpers, Mrs. Harper, her husband, and their 2 grown children, all standing together, smiling and greeting guests. Ellie's eyes locked with Mrs. Harper's for a moment, and she couldn't help but notice the surprise in the woman's gaze. It wasn't just that Ellie was dressed well, or that she looked confident. It was something more, a recognition that the woman who had once been invisible, the woman who had been dismissed and underestimated, was now standing before her as someone who had made her own mark on the world. For a moment, Ellie considered walking over to the Harpers and introducing herself. She could have shared the story of how her business had grown, how Lemongrass Glow had become a national sensation, and how she had gone from being the help to running her own empire. But then, just as quickly, she realized she didn't need to prove anything to them. She had already done that. The evening wore on, and Ellie found herself mingling with guests, her confidence growing with each passing moment. She spoke with people who were genuinely interested in her journey, people who saw her for who she truly was, not the person they had once assumed her to be. It wasn't long before Ellie was approached by one of the department store buyers she had been working with. They had heard of her success and wanted to meet her in person. The conversation flowed easily, and Ellie found herself sharing the story of Lemongrass Glow, the journey that had brought her here, and her vision for the future. As the conversation wrapped up, the buyer smiled and handed Ellie a business card. "I'm looking forward to working with you more," they said. "Your products are going places, Ellie, big places." Ellie's heart swelled with pride, but she didn't let it show. She knew that this was just another step in her journey, another reminder that she was no longer the invisible woman she had once been. She was here to stay. Later in the evening, as the crowd began to thin and the gala drew to a close, Ellie stood near the exit, watching the guests filter out into the night. Mrs. Harper approached her once more, this time with a warm smile. "I have to say, Ellie," Mrs. Harper said, her voice soft and genuine, "I'm impressed. You've done something remarkable. I never would have guessed." Ellie smiled, her voice steady. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I appreciate that." And as she walked out of the estate, her head held high, Ellie realized something profound. This moment wasn't about validation from others. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong or showing them that she was worthy. It was about finally recognizing her own worth, her own strength. She had built something from nothing, and she had done it all on her own terms. As she stepped out into the cool night air, Ellie felt a deep sense of peace settle within her. She wasn't just a maid who had once been mocked for smelling like lemongrass. She was a woman who had created her own future, and nothing at all could take that away from her. The early days following the Harper Estate Gala were filled with a newfound sense of peace, but Ellie knew the work was far from over. The night had been a symbolic victory, a turning point, but there were still countless challenges ahead. As she settled into her new role, Ellie found herself at a crossroads. Her business was growing, her reputation was strengthening, and yet the weight of everything still seemed to hang over her. like a quiet pressure pushing her forward. Since that evening at the Harper estate, Ellie's life had taken on a new rhythm. She no longer needed to prove herself to anyone. She had already done that, but still a part of her hungered for something more. Something that would solidify her as a true force in the world, not just as a product of her past, but as a woman who had risen from the ashes of her circumstances. Lemongrass Glow was now an established name in the beauty industry. Her products were available in major department stores, online beauty retailers, and even luxury spas. She was regularly contacted by influencers, celebrities, and business leaders who wanted to know more about the brand and its origins. Ellie's reputation was growing by the day, and yet, there were moments when she still found herself questioning if she was truly worthy of all this success. But as she sat at her desk one late afternoon, reviewing the latest sales reports, Ellie realized something. It wasn't about the validation anymore. It wasn't about whether the world saw her as a success. It was about what she had built. She had built a business from scratch, one that was growing, evolving, and making a real impact. And that, in itself, was a triumph far greater than any applause or recognition she could receive. The quiet triumph Ellie had been waiting for wasn't loud or obvious. It wasn't a grand celebration, nor was it a public acknowledgement of her success. It was something subtler, something deeper. It was the way she had come to understand herself, her strength, and her potential. She had learned that true success was not measured by how others viewed her, but by how she viewed herself. The days that followed saw Ellie diving even deeper into the logistics of scaling Lemongrass Glow. She had hired a team of dedicated professionals to handle production, marketing, and customer service, but Ellie was still very much hands-on. She found herself balancing the delicate art of delegating while staying involved in every decision, from selecting new product lines to brainstorming ways to improve the customer experience. The more Ellie worked, the more she realized that building a successful business was about creating something that people connected with, not just selling a product. One afternoon, as Ellie was finalizing the launch of a new line of products, she received a phone call that would change the course of her company's future. It was from a major beauty retailer in Los Angeles, one of the most prestigious in the world. The buyer had been impressed by Ellie's brand and wanted to discuss a potential exclusive partnership. The conversation was short but impactful. The buyer wanted to bring Lemongrass Glow into their high-end retail stores across the West Coast. The deal was huge, perhaps the biggest Ellie had ever seen. It was the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about when she first started out, back when her business was just a collection of jars and oils in her attic. But as Ellie listened to the buyer's pitch, something unexpected happened. She wasn't immediately consumed by excitement. She had learned to keep her emotions in check, to avoid getting swept away by the rush of success. Instead, Ellie took a moment to pause, to think it through. This was a significant commitment, one that would require even more investment and risk. It wasn't just about expanding her brand. It was about ensuring that she could continue to deliver the quality and care that had gotten her this far. She thanked the buyer for the opportunity, promising to follow up in the next few days with her decision. As Ellie hung up the phone, she couldn't help but smile. She was no longer the person who jumped at every opportunity without thinking. She was someone who understood the stakes, who knew that success wasn't just about saying yes to everything that came her way. It was about making decisions that aligned with her values and vision for the future. That evening, as Ellie sat on her balcony looking out over the skyline, she realized just how far she had come. She wasn't just the woman who had once worked as a maid. She wasn't the invisible woman she had once felt herself to be. She was a leader, a visionary, and someone who had the power to shape her own destiny. But even as Ellie celebrated this moment of triumph, she knew that her journey was far from over. This was only the beginning. There was still so much more to be done, so many more lives to impact, and so many more obstacles to overcome. The decision about the Los Angeles deal took a few days to make, but when Ellie finally agreed to the partnership, it felt like a natural step forward. She had grown both as a businesswoman and as a person. She wasn't making this decision out of desperation for validation. She was making it because she had built something worth investing in. She knew the road would continue to be difficult. There would be setbacks, obstacles, and new challenges that would test her resilience. But Ellie had become someone who could face them with strength, wisdom, and patience. In the months that followed, Lemongrass Glow expanded further, reaching new heights and new markets. Ellie found herself speaking at business conferences, offering advice to budding entrepreneurs, and receiving recognition for her commitment to ethical, natural skincare. But perhaps the most rewarding part of all of this success was how Ellie had remained grounded. She had not let the world's perception of her dictate her worth. She had learned to define her own success, to build her empire on her terms. The quiet triumphs continued to come, small moments that, when added together, made all the difference. The first time a customer reached out to Ellie to thank her for creating a product that had transformed their skin. The moment when a magazine editor asked to feature Lemongrass Glow in a beauty spread. The day she saw her products displayed in the windows of a major department store, her brand glowing like a beacon of possibility. Not in the accolades or the fame. It was in the way she had built something real, something lasting, something that reflected who she was at her core. She wasn't just a woman who had risen from the ashes. She was a woman who had created her own fire. As the months turned into years, Ellie continued to grow Lemongrass Glow, and the brand became a household name. She expanded her product line, launched new collections, and built a loyal customer base that believed in her vision. The business had grown, but Ellie had never lost sight of the values that had driven her from the start: authenticity, quality, and a deep connection to her roots. But perhaps the greatest triumph of all was the way Ellie had changed. She had gone from a woman who was overlooked and dismissed to a woman who commanded respect and admiration. She had built something real, something powerful, and she had done it with grace, humility, and integrity. Ellie's story wasn't just one of business success. It was a story of resilience, of quiet strength, and of the power of believing in yourself when the world has other plans for you. She had learned that success wasn't about competing with others. It was about embracing your own journey, trusting your instincts, and never letting anyone define who you were. And as Ellie looked out at the city she now called home, she knew that this was just the beginning. There were still more lives to touch, more dreams to build, and more triumphs to be earned. But for now, as the city lights sparkled before her, Ellie allowed herself a moment of peace, a moment to savor the quiet triumphs that had led her here. Ellie had learned to navigate the storm of success with a calm confidence. But even now, there were moments when the weight of her journey threatened to overwhelm her. She had come so far, but there was still a part of her that felt as though she was walking on a tightrope. The work never stopped. The demands never ceased. But as she stood in front of the mirror, her eyes meeting her reflection, she realized that she had built something more than a business. She had built a life. Today was the day Ellie had been waiting for, the day she would return to the Harper estate, but this time not as a maid, but as the successful entrepreneur she had become. The invitation had come a few weeks ago, seemingly out of nowhere. Mrs. Harper had sent her a letter, asking her to return to the estate for a private event. Ellie had almost laughed when the letter arrived. It was hard to imagine that the woman who had once treated her as invisible was now seeking her out, wanting her presence at an event of her own. But the invitation didn't feel like an acknowledgement of her success. It felt like a symbol of the full circle she had come to in her life. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about coming back to the place where it all began, where she had once been dismissed, and showing the world and herself that she had created something worth more than any judgment, any sneer, or any doubt. She had moved beyond the desire for validation. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about standing in her own power, acknowledging how far she had come, and embracing the journey that had led her here. As Ellie made her way to the Harper estate, the familiar sights of Connecticut filled her with a sense of nostalgia. The drive seemed shorter than she remembered, though the world around her had changed. She no longer felt like a visitor to this place, a servant who was unseen and unnoticed. She felt like someone who belonged, someone who had built a life beyond the expectations of others. When she arrived at the estate, she was greeted by the staff, who barely seemed to recognize her. She had spent so many years working here, but now, As she stepped through the front door, she felt as though she was entering a different world. A world she no longer needed to be a part of, a world she had outgrown. Inside, the estate was just as grand as it had always been. The towering chandeliers, the sweeping staircase, the marble floors. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. Ellie walked through the halls with a sense of quiet confidence, her eyes taking in the familiar surroundings, but her mind focused on what she had built, what she had achieved. She was no longer a small part of this world. She was a woman who had created her own space, and she had done it on her own terms. When Ellie entered the grand dining room, Mrs. Harper was waiting for her. The woman's face softened as she saw Ellie, but there was a subtle awkwardness in her demeanor. It was clear that Mrs. Harper was surprised to see Ellie looking so poised, so assured. Ellie hadn't seen her former employer in years, but she remembered the way Mrs. Harper had looked at her then. Eyes filled with condescension, judgment, and pity. "Ellie, Mrs. Harper said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "It's good to see you again." Ellie nodded, her smile polite but unyielding. She had no interest in rehashing old memories, no desire to explain how she had gotten here. This moment wasn't about Mrs. Harper. It was about Ellie, about the woman she had become. "It's good to see you too," Ellie replied, her voice calm, measured. She had already made her peace with the past. There was no need to prove anything now. The room was filled with guests, high-powered businesspeople, socialites, and philanthropists. Ellie could feel their eyes on her as she walked past them, their curiosity palpable. She was no longer just a maid, no longer just the woman who had worked in the background, unseen. Now, she was someone to be reckoned with, a successful businesswoman whose name had become synonymous with high-quality skincare. As Ellie made her way through the crowd, she overheard fragments of conversation, whispers, comments. Words that used to sting now felt like nothing more than passing thoughts. "Isn't that the woman who created Lemongrass Glow? I heard she's built an empire. I thought she was just the maid here. She looks different, so much more polished." Ellie couldn't help but smile to herself. These were the same people who had once dismissed her, who had once made her feel small. Now they saw her for what she had always been, a woman with potential, a woman who had the strength to rise above her circumstances and build something real. As the evening progressed, Ellie found herself speaking to several of the guests, many of whom were interested in her business and the story behind Lemongrass Glow. They asked her about the journey, the challenges, and the lessons she had learned along the way. Ellie spoke with ease, her confidence radiating as she shared her story. But what struck her the most was the respect in their eyes. These were people who had once looked at her as nothing more than the help. But now they were listening to her. They were asking for her advice. It wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about being heard. As Ellie spoke to one of the guests, a successful entrepreneur from Los Angeles, she realized just how much she had changed. This wasn't the quiet, invisible woman she had once been. This was a woman who had built something from nothing, a woman whose voice carried weight in a room full of powerful people. The recognition, the respect, it wasn't just about her business, it was about the person she had become in the process. Later in the evening, Mrs. Harper approached Ellie once more. This time, there was no awkwardness, no hesitation. The woman seemed genuinely proud, though Ellie knew that pride wasn't always easy to come by. "I have to say, Ellie," Mrs. Harper said, her tone warm, "I'm impressed. You've done something extraordinary. I never would have guessed." Ellie smiled, her heart filled with a quiet pride. "Thank you," she said simply. "It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it." For a moment, the two women stood there, quietly acknowledging each other. There was no need for grand speeches or elaborate explanations. The respect was mutual, unspoken, but understood. Ellie had risen above the limitations of her past. She had broken free from the mold that had been cast for her, and in doing so, she had created something that no one could take away. As the night came to a close, Ellie stood in the grand hallway of the Harper estate, looking around at the faces of the people who had once defined her. They didn't define her anymore. She had built a life that was hers, and hers alone. She had built a legacy, a business, a story, and a place in the world that could never be erased. Ellie stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of the bustling city filling her ears. She looked up at the stars, the lights of the city twinkling like a million possibilities ahead of her. She had come full circle, from the quiet maid who had once been dismissed, to the woman who had built an empire. She had proven to herself, and to the world, that she was capable of more than they ever imagined. This wasn't just a victory for her business. It was a victory for her spirit, for her resilience, and for every woman who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or ignored. Ellie had found her place, and she had done it her way. As she walked down the street, her heart light and full of purpose, Ellie knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. There was more to come, more challenges to face, and more lives to impact. But for now, she was content, knowing that she had built something that was real, and nothing, not even the past, could take that away. The city was quiet now, the hum of the streets softened by the thick layer of night. Ellie walked slowly down the dimly lit sidewalk, the soft rustling of leaves in the cool breeze whispering around her. Her feet moved deliberately, each step purposeful, like a person walking away from something, but also moving towards something new. She hadn't expected to feel this way, this peaceful, this light, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The night air filled her lungs with a calmness she had never known before. It was the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around you, not in the sense of emptiness, but in a way that brought stillness and clarity. A moment of reflection, of understanding. Ellie looked up at the sky, the faint glow of stars peeking through the vast expanse of the night. She had always loved this time of night. It was the time when the world seemed to slow down, when you could finally catch your breath. The world was asleep, but for her, this was the time when everything felt real, when everything came into focus. She had come full circle, hadn't she? There were no grand celebrations, no fireworks or confetti. But there was something far more profound. A peace that had settled deep inside her. A peace that had nothing to do with the accolades or the success of her business. It was a peace that came from knowing who she was, knowing where she had come from, and knowing that everything she had built was more than just a business. It was a testament to resilience, to quiet strength, to the unyielding belief that she could rise above the limitations the world tried to impose on her. Ellie smiled softly to herself as she kept walking. It wasn't the kind of smile that came from external validation. It wasn't the good job or I'm proud of you that most people lived for. No, this smile was hers and hers alone. It was a smile that only came from deep within, from a place that no one could touch. A place that had been buried for so long, but now was shining brightly, unashamed and proud. It had all started with the scent of lemongrass, hadn't it? The very scent that had once marked her as different, out of place, and not enough. It had been the thing people had ridiculed her for, the thing that had made her feel like an outsider in her own world. But now, Ellie realized, it was the very thing that had connected her to her roots, to her grandmother's teachings, to her mother's love. It was the thing that had anchored her when everything else felt unstable. Lemongrass had been the scent of home, of resilience, of natural beauty, and it had carried her through her darkest days. Now it was the signature of her empire. It was no longer a symbol of her weakness, her place in the background. It was a symbol of her strength, her journey, and her success. People had once mocked her for smelling like lemongrass. Now they admired it, even sought it out, as a reminder that strength often comes in quiet, unassuming forms. Ellie paused for a moment in front of a small park bench and sat down, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. The sound of the city seemed to fade away as she focused on the beating of her own heart. The truth was, she wasn't just proud of lemongrass glow. She was proud of herself, not just for what she had built, but for the person she had become. When she had started this journey, she had no idea where it would lead. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, had to keep pushing through the walls that had been built around her. It wasn't just the walls of the Harper estate. It was the walls that society had built, the walls that had told her she wasn't enough, that her background didn't matter, that the color of her skin and the scent of her oils made her less than. But Ellie had broken through those walls. Slowly, quietly, but with a force that no one had expected. She had taken the whispers, the mockery, and the rejection, and turned them into fuel. She had built something from that fuel, a business, a life, a legacy. Ellie knew that there would be more challenges ahead. There would always be obstacles, always someone who doubted her or tried to tear her down. But for the first time in her life, Ellie didn't fear those challenges. She welcomed them because she knew with every fiber of her being that she had the strength to face them head-on. She had faced the hardest battles, against herself, against others, against the world, and she had come out on top. And that was the quiet victory, the triumph that couldn't be measured in awards or recognition. It was the victory of having the courage to keep going, of trusting in yourself even when the world didn't, of knowing that the path ahead, no matter how difficult, was the one that would take you exactly where you were meant to be. The lights of the city twinkled before her, a reminder of the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Ellie's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the darkness. She didn't know where the next chapter of her journey would take her, but she knew one thing for sure. She was ready for whatever came next. As she stood up from the bench, she felt a new energy coursing through her veins. She had worked hard to get here. She had earned every step. And now, as she walked back toward her apartment, she felt the weight of her own power. Quiet, steady, but unstoppable. Ellie had always thought that success was about being seen. But now she knew better. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about being true to yourself, about knowing your worth, and never letting anyone, no matter how powerful, convince you that you were less than what you truly were. She walked through the quiet streets of Brooklyn, her heart beating in sync with the rhythm of the world around her. The city was still waking up, but Ellie was already awake. She had found her place, and now she was ready to make her mark. As she reached her apartment, Ellie paused for a moment to look up at the building, its silhouette standing against the rising sun. This was her home now, not just the apartment, but the life she had created for herself. And in that quiet moment, Ellie realized that she had everything she needed. She had built something real, something that would last. It wasn't just the products or the brand. It was the belief that she was worthy, that she was capable of more than anyone had ever given her credit for. She smiled to herself and turned toward the door, her steps light and filled with purpose. There was still more to do, more to build, but for now she was content. Because Ellie knew that the most important victory had already been won. It was the victory of believing in herself, the victory of never giving up,